Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Chloe Thistleverse, and I have a very exciting guest today. I will be interviewing Tamara Jeree, who is a short story author. And I'm going to read from their bio just so that you can get a little snippet about, their writings and what they're up to. So Tamara Jeree is a games writer, poet, and short fiction writer, a graduate of Purdue University's creative writing MFA program, the Odyssey Writing Workshop, and Code Coven. They write queer femme strangeness topped with gloomy sparkles. Their poem, Goddess Enforced Repose, was nominated for the inaugural Ignyte Award. They are sometimes at work on a novel. Is there anything you would like to add to the bio?
I think that's accurate. I try to keep it updated. I try to keep the website updated. Thank you.
Yes, no problem. So could you walk us through your writing journey? You write games, you write poetry, you write short fiction. How did you get into each of those?
Yeah. Gosh, okay, I'm gonna try for the short version of this. So we're not here all day. I think, yeah, so when I went to college, it feels forever ago, when I was in undergrad, but I started out as a psych major, and then I was because everyone tells you that writing is terribly impractical and you will never get a job and you will never make any money. And so I was terrified and tried to do something semi-practical. And then, but I mean, writing felt like the thing, so eventually I came back to it, decided to do an MFA in creative writing at Purdue. And that felt like a really big step because originally I was like, oh, I'm not going to do the MFA thing. And I decided that was the path for me. From there, went to Odyssey, which is specifically a fantasy, science fiction, and horror writing workshop. And it's something that I felt was super influential and good for my writing. And I met a lot of great people there who I'm still in touch with. And then, yeah, I did that before the final year of my MFA. And then I graduated into the pandemic and everything that was happening in 2020. And so I reached out to one of my Odyssey classmates, and I was like, I knew that she worked in games, and I was like, I really can't see myself doing much else other than writing. I published a couple of short stories by then, and so I had that for my portfolio, and yeah, just kept throwing my stuff out there, and eventually got a mentorship in games, and a traineeship with an indie studio, and so that was kind of my path into games writing. And yeah, still just working on my own short fiction and poetry, working on a novella, querying that right now. And yeah, kind of writing for games as my day job and doing my own stuff in my free time. So yeah, it's I feel like it's been such a long journey, but I can everyone who told me that writing was a super impractical thing and I would never make a living off of that, I'm feel really thankful to say that I actually am doing that now. It feels unreal.
I am not super familiar with games writing, unfortunately. Could you tell a little bit more about what type of games you write?
Yeah, so I have only next month, so in November will really be my 1 year anniversary in the games industry. That's when I started my traineeship and was actually being paid for my work. And so yeah, I've kind of worked in on some indie games, some smaller projects as a freelancer. And right now my big project is with a studio in Sweden, Star Stable Entertainment. They're working on a new RPG MMO thing that's like centered around like magic, and we're trying to build like diverse characters and center story and stuff like that. So kind of like my average, we're still like in the early stages there. So my average workday right now, I'm doing a lot of world building stuff. So just like, yeah, collaborating with like the other writers on the team, and we're all just like throwing ideas out there, you know, and so a lot of world building stuff, a lot of just like pitching character ideas, kind of like preliminary like quest writing that will probably not end up in the final game, but we're just kind of testing stuff out right now. Dialogue and stuff like that. So it's very different. It feels very different than writing prose. And it's been, I think maybe like the most challenging thing for me, like coming from like mostly prose background, doing a little bit, dabbling in some poetry, is kind of like the interactive bit of it, because someone is going to like enter your world and experience it, maybe not the way that you thought about, or you just have to think about like the player. When I write, I'm not so much thinking about, oh, what is the reader going to want here? I feel like that's a very quick way to make yourself like, you know, so I'm not thinking about the reader in that way. And so like switching gears and thinking about what would a player want here? What would be interesting? What's compelling to interact with, is kind of like still a new thing for me. And games is just like so much more collaborative, unless you're a solo dev and you're like indie and you're like super talented. Solo devs are so talented, unless you're just like doing all your own stuff, you're doing the art, you're doing the writing, you're doing the coding. Like for the most part, games is super collaborative, and I love that about it, and it's so energizing. I think especially during the pandemic, when we're all just like at home alone, and writing is often like such a solitary activity. So it's nice to be able to like hop on a call with a colleague and be like, I'm thinking about like this this world building detail, or this character detail, or like this plot thing, like what do you think about it, what can we add to it, and just like getting into a Word doc together and like, oh my god, I love that idea, I'm going to add to that. They're like, I like your idea, I'm going to add to that, what if, and you kind of just like, I don't know, it just feels like a really cool jam session. And just like, yeah, I love working with other people, and it's a really nice change from just like sitting at my desk alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's really funny, like what happens with your work when it's out in the world, right? Like, you know, Legend of Zelda is like a quest-based video game, and like I have like siblings who play like it's Sims basically. They just like playing with the chickens and smashing the pots, and like they haven't completed really any of the quests.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, no, I get that. I was curious, like, how did like the skills you've like developed in each of these different kind of writings, do you feel like there's like an overlap in the skill sets? Do you feel like these different types of writings like inform each other in ways you hadn't thought of? Like for me personally, when I read your short fiction and then found out that you also write poetry, I'm like, this makes a lot of sense to me.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, when I was in my MFA, the program was kind of like split into a fiction track and a poetry track. And fiction writers could take the poetry workshop, and poets could take the fiction workshop, but for the most part, like people like stayed in like the two workshops the ones that they signed up for. And so the people who crossed over, who decided to take like a workshop in the other form, everyone was like, you're a bit terrifying, that you're just like out here trying to do both. And so, yeah, I felt like writing speculative fiction, there's some ideas that could definitely go in like a prose story, but I feel like they're just more compelling in the form of a poem. And I'm still not quite sure like how I define that, because I feel like a lot of my poems are very narrative, because I don't know, I'm a prose writer, so my brain just thinks in that way. but yeah, I don't know. It's just like some ideas you're like, this is a small idea and it's not flash. It's definitely a poem. As far as games, I feel like there's definitely a lot of like I don't know, like the ability to tell a story and like engage a reader is I feel like there's a lot of crossover, especially with the kind of games that I'm interested in. So usually RPGs, visual novels, stuff like that, games that really center the story and center like character development and stuff like that are the kinds of games that I'm really drawn to as a player. The world build either way, that's just like a thing that I love. A lot of fantasy writers love. Um, and so I think that has definitely crossed over, like when we're just like, we have kind of a blank slate, like what is going on in this place? How are we telling this story? That definitely crosses over. I feel like the main thing, like I said, that I'm learning is like that interactivity bit, because I'll come up with like a story chunk, like a chunk of plot, and I'll ask one of my coworkers and be like, I've got this chunk of like story. And sometimes I'm like, I can see how the player could enter into it and like interact with that and poke around. And then sometimes I'm like, this is just like story and it's not interactive yet. And like making that something that would be interesting for someone who's not me to enter. And most games writing is like writing shorter. And so I feel like my poetry like writing kind of helps there with just like conveying a big idea in like a small chunk. You know, because you write a lot of like item descriptions, those have to be short. You write a lot of dialogue that needs to be, you know, you can't just have a character like monologue forever and ever and ever for paragraphs. That's not interesting to the player. And so just like learning, like leaning more into dialogue. I feel like a lot of when I write prose, I used to be very afraid of dialogue and used to think that dialogue was not my strongest thing. And then like getting better at that over time, I think has really helped with writing games and just like understanding like the rhythm of speech, how people speak differently. So yeah, just I think like writing more concisely is really important in games.
That's really interesting. I'm very interested in how people bring like all the different parts of their lives together into their writing, and like especially when people do write for like different purposes. I'm like a newbie poetry reader, so I didn't really have the chops to like ask you like good questions about your poem upon learning My Girlfriend is a Mermaid. But I just wanted to give it a moment of love and like recommend it to any viewers. Like absolutely give it a read. I loved it. I was like, I need to tweet about it. I need to talk about it with someone. Like I need to find a friend to hoist this on so they can like emote with this about me. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So like on to more of your short fiction. One of your short stories I really enjoyed was The Future in Saltwater, which is about a child who's bonded with an octopus god. And religion is very like central to the story. I hadn't really seen a religious system like this before. And I was curious, why did you create a religion where the ocean is central? And like how did you decide the relationship you wanted your characters to have with like their gods and their beliefs?
Yeah, I feel like I wish that I had like a novel that I could talk about because I feel like a lot of the times when I'm working on novels, one of the things that I keep being drawn back to over and over again is just like these magic systems that are like kind of a religion in that world, and just like creating these like fictional belief systems is something that I have a lot of fun with when I world build, and it hasn't shown up a lot in my short fiction. And when I was thinking about it, I was like, I feel like I do this a lot, and then I was like, oh, I haven't actually, like people haven't seen that. Yeah, so I think the inspiration for this story and kind of the way that I like thought through the relationship with the ocean and how these people feel about it. I grew up on the coast for like I'd say the first 12 years of my life. I lived in Florida, and then from there my dad was military. We moved to Iceland And most cities in Iceland are on the coast. And so I was like moved from one peninsula to another peninsula. The ocean just felt like completely different there. But I feel like I've always just like, I don't know, just been fascinated by that landscape, and how meaningful that is to like the places that live by the water. I think that a lot of SFF authors right now are like writing climate fiction. And so I was thinking about that in like a fantastical way, and then thinking about like what it is to lose, what it would be like to lose this part of the landscape that's like really meaningful and like central to your like way of life and your understanding of the world. Um, and so one of the first things that kind of like popped into my head, one of the first like pieces for this story was when the temple mother says, "I've never known a child to kill a god." Um, and I was like, okay, I have to like go back and figure out like how do I arrive? How do I arrive at this point? Um, so just like, yeah, the fact that in the story, the ocean is, I mean, like as scientists are predicting, you know, like with the temperatures rising, trash in the ocean, like toxins in the ocean. And so these people have had to move away from the ocean and they've lost their lifeways. And so now they're inland and trying to maintain this connection to the ocean, and keep these like sacred creatures that they're connected to. And so I felt like in the story, like the belief system that they have is kind of like mirroring the ocean, and that they're both very fragile. They've both been disrupted. How do how do you hold on to this thing that's like rapidly dying, and that you're afraid of losing? And so I think that's why, with both systems so fragile, it just felt like, like one child making a decision out of fear of loss, because they've already lost so much. They're afraid of losing more. And so like one child can have like this really big effect on their culture, on their town, on their lifeways, on their belief systems. And so I feel like it could have easily been like more of a chosen one story, but rather like the narrator is like making these mistakes and kind of like discovering their own like unique connection to like how they fit into their culture's belief.
I was also curious about like your approach to gender when you're writing characters in story. So like in this story, the speaker's gender and pronouns aren't stated, but other people's are. And I think you've done something similar in other of your stories, like A Serpent for Each Year and On Lore. And I was curious why you wrote the story this way, and like how do you decide which stories you're going to use this approach for?
Yeah, I thought this question was super interesting. Because I was like, I think in answering this, I'm gonna end up like calling myself out here. In that for the future in salt water, I tried to use like gender neutral language for the protagonist. So a couple people around the narrator will use words like child, and not gender them. And so I felt like maybe that their pronouns aren't stated, but hopefully that like the fact that people are like this child, this person, so they're genderless in that way. And then for the other stories, I felt like in drafting them and like really getting like immersed in those worlds, I was so focused on like how loss and the fear of loss is really central in those stories too, and that the narrators are kind of like overwhelmed by it. um, those are also two of my shorter pieces. So A Serpent for Each Year is like, I don't know, 500 words. And then On Lore, I think started out a bit shorter, but might be like just a little bit over 1,000 words. And so in both of those stories, I felt like, like trying to get into the narrator's mindset, and how they're so like overwhelmed by this fear or overwhelmed by this loss. I just that was everything in the story. And so gender didn't really come up as much as it does maybe in my other work. And one thing that I thought was really interesting, though, is everyone who I've either given the story to in workshop or other people who've talked to me about it, I think it's interesting that no one thought the characters were men at any point, regardless. Even though I wasn't super clear on what the narrator's pronouns were or anything like that. And I was like, then I started thinking about that, and I was like, that's really interesting. I don't know if it's just because I'm the writer, and my name is at the top, that most people seem to read those narrators as either being non-binary or being women. But yeah, I think for those other two shorter stories, it's just the narrator is so consumed with this thing that's so large in their life that everything else kind of just is consumed by that.
I think I was in the camp of I had made an assumption also that they weren't men, and then I was because I think I'd read To the Moon first, and I think I was introduced to you through settings where it was mostly an all female cast, and then went back and I was reading, I was like, wait, that's actually not stated anywhere. Why did I think that? And so I was just wanted to ask. I was curious. So one of your stories I really enjoyed is At the Mouth of the Sea, which is about this yearly mass enamoring of these village girls with these transient mermaids who just kind of stop by their island for an undisclosed reason, leave for an undisclosed reason, and just never reappear again. I was struck by how heartbreak is just such a central part of life in this town. It's kind of almost an intergenerational bonding experience between the parents and the children. And I was wondering why you made a town where this is just such a part of the culture.
Yeah, I all of your questions are getting to I was eventually someone's going to discover that all of the stories are just about sad people losing things. And so I think, yeah, whoever watches this interview is going to be like, this writer just writes about sad people losing things. And so kind of I guess going back in order to answer the question. So there was the thing that I was working on before I wrote this piece was my thesis novel for my MFA. And in that story, I'm dealing a lot with connection, childhood connection to their mothers, and examining those relationships after they have lost their mothers, and how they understand those relationships. And so one of the mermaid character from this story is actually one of the main characters from that novel. And I was thinking about kind of where what she was doing before she arrives into that story. And so this story happened. And yeah, since I was already kind of thinking about how loss and having gone through similar experiences is bonding characters together, that kind of, I think, birthed this idea of this culture. And actually, one thing, when the last revision that I did for this story, before I sent it out to Mermaids Monthly, I added one of the next to last scenes where the protagonist goes and talks to her mother about and asks what was your mermaid like, what was your relationship like, and they kind of bond over this these mermaids that they love that are no longer with them. And I felt that finally the story felt, once I did that and I had that moment where the narrator actually goes and talks to her mother and it's I am heartbroken, and kind of says her mermaid's name aloud with her mother, and they're able to comfort each other over this. That's when the story felt finally complete to me. And so yeah, I think it's interesting that you ask about this intergenerational tradition. I guess what is being revealed here is that I'm very interested in how I don't know, how people come together and how they like heal each other after loss. I feel like it's really powerful to be able to, like go to someone and be vulnerable, and for them to be like vulnerable with you, and for you to like share like this difficult like thing, like emotional thing that you have both been through, and be like, yes, I see your pain. And I think especially because it's like mothers and their daughters, and that's kind of the tradition, is just mothers and their daughters. I think, I don't know, at least for me and the people I know, it's sometimes like really awkward, or it feels impossible to like go to your parents and be like, I am heartbroken. And like parents are always, they're like, oh, when I was young, and it won't, your first relationship, it won't last, it's fine. And I guess I was like really interested in like, no, but like, what is it to actually talk honestly and vulnerably with your parents about something like heartbreak? And I just felt like that could be potentially like very powerful and healing. And so I think that's why I just have this whole village of sad people who have to uh, like talk about and like talk through their heartbreak. Kind of maybe came from this like unconscious thing that I've been like turning over forever in my head.
Yeah, I also like the punny name that you gave for the heartbreak in this story. It's kind of, the people have a name for it, and I encourage you to read this story so you too can enjoy the pun.
Mm-hmm.
And I was also wondering a little bit more about the mermaids themselves. Like the mermaids in the story were very different from the lore that I read growing up. Not that I was like super well read in it, but just like, oh, I watched The Little Mermaid a few times. This is an Ariel. And I was curious,
Yeah.
how did you decide what your mermaids would look like and how they'd behave? And I was also wondering, like, if you were to encounter these mermaids just like out on the coast, how would you react?
Yeah, so my idea for these mermaids once again came from like the longer piece that I was working on about them, where I go more into their I guess like more into their culture, and their beliefs and their homes and stuff like that. And I think my goal, I was like, I'm gonna make some queer monstrous mermaids. Was kind of just the goal. And I was just like, how do I make like, how do I make their bodies like queerer? And Ayeli has like shark teeth, like she just has rows of sharp teeth. So not a very human mouth. I'm like, you live in the ocean, maybe it's helpful. But yeah, so I think that was my inspiration, because I feel like SFF authors get the like advice, like the writing advice all the time, that it's like, if you're going to take kind of like a well-established like creature or trope or whatever, you have to do something to like distinguish it and make it original and make it your own, and then also have a reason for like doing so. And I feel like I thought about this most with vampires because I love vampire fiction, super into vampires. Strangely, I don't have any vampire stories out. um, but I thought about this question a lot with vampires, about like, yeah, just how to make them unique and different, and what changes you make say about the world of the story, and the characters themselves. So yeah, so I think maybe I think I was like, okay, these mermaids, they can't just, um, they'll be Tamara mermaids. Um, and as far as, yeah, like encountering one of them, I would be like, that's really badass. you know, um, I don't know. I wanted to make them, they're like, these half human, half like, uh, aquatic creatures. But I think I wanted to lean more towards um, like what do their bodies, like what would it actually make sense for their bodies to be like if they live in the water and they don't reproduce the way that humans reproduce? Like it wouldn't make sense for them to have like human traits if they're just living their lives in the ocean. So yeah, that was kind of like the thinking that went into that.
There was like one scene in particular where I think it was Ayeli transforms. And before that, I was just like, oh, they're mermaids. Like they don't call themselves mermaids, but regular mermaid stuff. And there's something about how she just like couldn't get the human transformation quite right. That was like very uncanny. I was like, wait, no one's no one's running for the hills.
Yeah, she doesn't. I was really interested, like the part of the mermaid myth, where it's like they like make this like trade-off in order to walk on land. But I was like, what if they were just kind of shapeshifters, because they're kind of like half human anyway. And so I thought it would be interesting if they could just like choose to shapeshift and make their bodies different at will because they wanted to. And I was like, but if you don't really know what you're doing, like you can change your shape, but if you don't know, you don't know what you should be doing and you've never done it before, your legs might not be what a human would expect. So yeah.
Oh, I also had a kind of circling back to the first question about like this like mass enamoring with them. And like I don't know if that really happens, I guess. Like for me in my daily life, like I don't know if there's like big parts of Twitter for like boy bands, but I don't think there's this mass moment where it feels like just like big, like every like every queer woman is being like, oh my god, she's so pretty. So I was really struck by that, I think. And I was wondering, like, was that like a thing that was kind of in your head as you're writing this story, or I don't know, did it just kind of happen? That was
Wow.
just
This is a great question. I feel like you're revealing so much about me. I guess maybe I'm just really gay. And so I was like, it'd be cool if like there's just all these like really cool women and they come out of the sea and all of the women in the town are like, we should have a relationship. So maybe I feel like that part of the story just kind of happened. I don't think I gave it a lot of thought. I was just like, what if there's just like this courtship ritual thing that happens every year among like these women from the sea and these women from this village. Yeah, and I don't think I gave it much more thought than that, honestly. That's probably not a great writer answer, to be like, actually I didn't think about this thing at all. But yeah, no, I think I'm just really queer, and so the work came out really queer.
I think it's just like from a reader perspective, I'm like curious like what shapes these decisions, or if there's like a funny story or something behind it. I feel like when I talk to authors a lot of times like it's just what I want to write, just it seemed cool, so I did it.
Yeah,
So
honestly, yeah.
yeah, I don't know, it was just like that I enjoyed. I was like also like there's like the heartbreak and the sadness, but also like this communal like, oh, we just love these people. So I don't know, I feel like it's kind of lonely with just like you and like a handful of other queer friends. You're like, is this celebrity gorgeous? Like, oh, look at this like cute wrestler or something like that. And it's just nice. I was like, everyone. It's just like,
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I I guess I'm just me. So I didn't think that like hard about it, but I really love this reading now and I'm super attached to it. And thank you so much for giving this to me. Like I feel like you've given me a gift today. Of making this gay story gayer. So thank you.
Thank you for writing it. So I had some questions about your poetry in general. I guess, how did you find out about speculative poetry? How did you start writing it? And do you have like any like speculative poetry like influences?
Yeah. I think my way into poetry was just, because it's like I think a lot of writers when we're younger, we just write poems and they're bad. I wrote a lot of bad high school poetry. And then I put it aside because I was like, I am not good at this. I don't need to do this anymore. And then when I got to the MFA and actually like knowing people who's like, for them, like poetry was like their main thing. Um, I think that really like changed my perspective on it. I feel like a lot of people, like even if they love literature and they love reading or they love writing, aren't very aware of contemporary poetry. And I wasn't either, you know, like you read the stuff in high school and it's all by dead people. And so I think like coming here and talking about the work of poets who are currently alive, who we can like talk to and interview and stuff like that, was really like changed everything for me. And I got a ton of great poetry recommendations from my classmates, started reading that stuff, and was just like, I'm like, wow, this is doing so much. This is just like changing how I think about writing. And kind of like, yeah, it gave me, like I was saying before, like an outlet for those ideas that were like very image driven, very like image driven, and more like lyrical, and I didn't really felt like they would make like, you know, a prose story. And so I started just like getting back into poetry, with like writing it, as well as reading it. Unlike with prose, I feel like there's less of a divide in poetry between like literary poetry and speculative poetry, because even in like the biggest, you know, literary magazines, I would find speculative poetry. Like it's just everywhere. And it's not really, I felt like there wasn't the kind of pushback that I felt in the MFA. Like when I was writing speculative work, I felt there was a bit of pushback from professors, but I didn't feel like that with poetry, and I thought that was really interesting. So I would say actually a lot of my like poetry influences are probably like more in like a different like literary community. And then I was like, okay, I have these poems, and I feel like I, you know, like maybe I could send them out to the places my peers are sending their work out, to more like literary magazines. But I was like, I'm really interested in like the speculative fiction community and staying in the same, like kind of the same space where I was aiming to publish my my fiction. And so actually the very first thing I had published was poetry, and not fiction, which was really funny for me, because I'd spent the most work on my fiction, but my poetry got picked up first, at Strange Horizons. I was looking around for places where I could send stuff, and I think like a lot of readers of speculative fiction, I wasn't really paying a lot of attention to and wasn't really aware that there were like a lot of magazines had like a poetry side. So like Uncanny, Strange Horizons, like a lot of magazines don't publish poetry, but some of them do. And so I just started reading that work. And I'm not really sure. I feel like people have asked this question before where they're like, is there like a difference between like speculative poetry and like, I don't know, like the poetry that's coming out of like more like academic spaces? And I don't know. I couldn't define that, but yeah, I think that was kind of like um my journey with poetry.
I know I asked for recommendations for speculative poets specifically, but like if you have just general recommendations you'd like to share,
Oh yeah, yeah.
that would totally be helpful.
Oh gosh. Okay. Okay. I really love, and I feel like this is gonna be silly because I like actually know him and took a class with him. But Kava Akbar, I feel like reading his poetry collection years ago, Calling a Wolf a Wolf, I was like, oh my God, this is like, I was just like, this is mind blowing. I would, you know, and that's work that really inspired me to like get more into poetry and read more stuff. I think I'm looking at my shelf right now because every time people ask me for recommendations, I forget everything. Everything goes away. I might have to like make a tweet later of like my recommendations. Oh, one that I really liked last year. I Can't Talk About the Trees Without the Blood. Amazing. Another one. Okay. Hold on. Let me think about it. Let me think. Soft Science, by Franny Choi. I think that was the book that I was like, the genre divisions do not exist in poetry. They don't exist, because that book is exploring like androids and AI consciousness and stuff like that. So I think speculative readers would really like that collection. Let's see, another one that I loved, Ode to Lithium by Shira Ehrlichman. I think that's the name. But that one was really important to me, with like reading the experiences of someone who was kind of like processing like their journey with like getting their diagnosis of like of bipolar, and kind of like processing that experience. And I felt like it was I feel like that's where like poetry can be really powerful, is you just like, it's kind of like with memoir, where you find like an author whose like voice and experience is really like speaking to you like personally in your experience. And I felt like I just, yeah, like recognized so much of my own like experience trying to like figure out what was going on with me, and like navigate like the mental health care system and all of the shitty things that can happen to people when you're like trying to seek help. Yeah, so that collection also was like really big for me. I can keep naming things, but yeah, those are the ones that like immediately like came to mind right now, is those four.
Thank you for the recommendations. I was also curious, I know some of your poetry does like the all lowercase thing, and I was curious, like, what do you like about that form?
Yeah, I don't know, I feel like it is softer. I mean, like a lot of poetry does this, right? And I think I just like, this is one of the things where it's just like writers just steal techniques from other writers, you know. And I liked how the poetry written in like all lowercase, or that kind of like dispensed with like conventional punctuation or any punctuation at all, and just kind of like relies on line break to kind of like punctuate and like structure the sentences in the story. I don't know, for the poems that I wrote like that, it's like when you're like texting a friend, and I have a couple friends who just like text in all lowercase, and it just feels like softer and intimate and less like, I don't know, like rigid, and like you're like exposing something, and you're being vulnerable, and you're being honest. And I don't know if that's like actually what's I don't know if that's like technically like from a craft perspective, from like poets who know more than me, I don't know if that's like actually it, but that's how I always read those poems, just kind of like playing with breaking stuff down. And I think it also gets me out of, I had a friend who was like, I was like, could you give me feedback on this poem? And he was like, this is cool, but like you're writing with like your prose brain. And I was like, what? I'm writing with my prose brain. Um, and that was the first time anyone like told me, like gave me feedback like that about my poetry, because I was like very predictably like breaking my sentences and like structuring them, and like punctuating them in like a very just like, correct conventional way. And so I think also just like playing with capitalization and like those kinds of like standard rules kind of like also helps me. Sometimes I will just like draft a poem, just like write it, no punctuation, no capitalization, just like kind of like type out the words, and then think about line breaks after. It depends on the poem. But I think it helps me, especially if I've been writing a lot of prose, helps me kind of like break out of more, I don't know, rigid, more structured ways of thinking about the sentence and thinking about lines. Yeah.
You've written a lot of work by this point, like many short stories, many poems. I was wondering if there's like one that you're particularly proud of, or maybe like a top three, if you, it's hard to pick just one.
um Gosh, I think, and now like, okay, so when people ask me for recommendations, everything I've ever read, I forget. And now I have forgotten everything that I've ever written, apparently. I think as far as, trying to think back, I think as far as my poems, one of my, it's weird to name your own, your own like ranking of your own work, but I'm really attached to I've been trying to write like this series of moon poems. And so those are the ones that I'm just like, there's, I don't know, I'm like exploring something there, and I feel like I'm still discovering like uncovering exactly what those poems are about. But the one that's written from like the perspective of like a person filling out an application to be like a pilot, with this like weird creepy surveillance AI. That one I think is like really close to my heart.
That worship captain application, was that in Strange Horizons?
Yeah.
Okay.
I forgot the title of my own thing, so thank you. Yeah, worship captain application. And that one was more of a prose poem, and it's kind of chunky. And then I think, yeah, the one that you named, upon learning my girlfriend is a mermaid, which is very, very narrative. And again about fear of loss. And then I think as far as the short stories that I have out, one of them is coming out at the end of the month in Neon Hemlock's Unfettered Hexes anthology, and that one is also dealing with loss and death, and kind of like the things we were talking about with traditions that are fragile, and trying to like maintain connection to like ancestry and place. That is not death nor the storm. So you can get that one from Neon Hemlock's website. It's on pre-order right now, and I think they're supposed to be shipping them like end of the month. My contributor copy I think is still in the mail, or else I would hold up. It has a gorgeous cover, a very queer cover. It's just all of these like magical people entwined. I'm like, oh my god, this is an amazing cover. So that's one that I wrote this year, that I'm pretty proud of. And then I think my story in Beneath Ceaseless Skies, In Case You're the One to Devour a Star, came out, was it last month? I'm losing track of time.
It was very recently. I think it was last month.
Okay. Thank you. You're just like I forgot everything, and you're just like, let me tell you. Thank you. But yeah, In Case You're the One to Devour a Star, also dealing with fear of loss. But yeah, that one I returned to like this setting from my first published story, which is this world of like feathered dragons and poetry magic and fire magic. And so that one's also really close to my heart.
Part of like, getting that perfect poem or that perfect short story is like editing and like the feedback and stuff. I know sometimes people give you feedback that kind of hurts, but you have to trust them. Or maybe, I don't know, I guess sometimes maybe you don't, but like I was curious, what's the hardest edit you've had to make on anything you've written?
The hardest edit I've ever had to make, I think the way the workshops I've been in, one, I wish I remembered who told me this, but one thing someone said about workshop advice and feedback is like, you don't have to take the feedback. Maybe the feedback is even like, it's not right for the story, but the fact that someone told you, like the fact that someone is telling you like, this isn't quite working for me, and I think maybe this other thing would work. Maybe the thing they're suggesting is like not necessarily the solution, but the fact that they're telling you like this thing like feels off to me is like, that's, you need to pay attention, like even if you don't necessarily like implement that, what they're telling you to do, the fact that like their instinct is like pinging this thing is like, maybe pay attention to this, is really helpful. I think for me, the story that I ended up revising the most was Our Souls to the Moon. And that was one of the stories that I drafted at Odyssey. I turned in a version of it and people were like, whoa, this is real weird. Love the imagery, but what is going on? Like, what is this? And I was like, okay, I hear that. And so at Odyssey, she let us, we had the option of, instead of turning in a new story, we could turn in like a significant revision of another story. And my significant revision was just, I threw out the old story and I just like redrafted it with like the same character names and the same setting and like the kind of the same ending. Because everyone was just like, this is cool, we like the language, we're not sure what is happening. And so I think that's the one story where I think I just like, I went all in on the feedback. Like I highlighted all over people's stuff. I was like tallying like common advice. Like I was like 5 people said like this exact thing, and then like other people, and kind of like just sitting with that and absorbing it. And then that's the new story was kind of like born out of like taking all of that feedback and sitting with it and being like, I still want it to be like real weird, but it needs to make some kind of sense. And so I don't know if anyone's like given me like feedback that was like hard for me yet. It could happen. I feel like people have definitely given me like recommendations to do some really heavy revisions or edits or something like that. Usually, like I said before, like there's something like that instinct like means something. And so I'll like take that and be like, okay. It's not resonating exactly the way I want to. How can I make this like hit harder or whatever? So yeah, that was the one story that I felt like I really just tore it apart. It was not the same at the end. It was a whole new story, basically. Yeah.
A quick, I guess, glimpse into Our Souls to the Moon for people who aren't familiar with it and are like wondering, why should I read it? It's like Gilded Era, like shirtwaist factory fire, like industrial work setting mixed with like interstellar looking at the moon, but also drugs somehow, and like eyes made of stone. So give it a read. Like I don't know how I can make it any more intriguing than that. Yeah. So something I also really like with people who write short fiction is like the little like hints that there are like connections between maybe like a novel that comes out down the line or even just like other stories that are in world. And you had mentioned that When You Find a Dragon, Name Them for Me is in the same world as In Case You're the One to Devour a Star, and also that At the Mouth of the Sea is kind of like going to be happening after a novel that we haven't seen yet. I was curious, I guess, are there any other like hints you could give us about connections to look for, or what's that feel that you get about a universe? It's like, okay, I need to write like more stories about this. I need like more tales, even if like I'm the only one who knows that they're connected.
Yeah, I think the ones that you named are the only ones that have a really clear connection to something else, to like another piece. I have 2 others that are kind of like thematically connected, but they are not out. So I can't talk about them as much. But yeah, I guess as far as the question, how do I kind of like get that feeling? Yeah, I think so many of us as like SFF writers were like so into our world building. And that's something, I know for me, it's one of the things that got me writing, right? And it's the thing that really attracted me to the fantasy genre, was just like the ability for these authors to like make these vast universes and make them feel like believable and lived in. And so I think it's like once you there's so much, especially in short stories, that you end up not exploring. And I think it's like once you put all the work into like making this world and making like the rules for this, it like spins around in the back of your mind and you're like, I have this thing. And with In Case You're the One to Devour a Star, I didn't intend to, I wasn't like setting out like, like I have all this lore that I set up and When You Find a Dragon, so I'm gonna like use that again because I've already built it, and I want to keep exploring it. Wasn't so much the thinking. I actually originally drafted that story to submit to a themed anthology, and I was like, what can I do that fits? What can I do that fits? And then I came up with this idea, and I was like, I have this setting, and I love it. And in When You Find a Dragon, at the point that I enter that world, it's falling apart. And so there's kind of like this whole quest to like save this culture's knowledge from just like being lost forever, because as we've established, I'm obsessed with that as a theme. And so I wanted to go back to like what established that tradition in the first place. So the extreme opposite end of that world. So it's like in the same world, but it's taking place in a completely different time period with different characters. And kind of the main connecting thing is that there are these dragons that hold memory. And so, yeah, just wanted to like look at like a different facet of that and how the tradition started. And I think that's how that story was generated. And then for the mermaid story, because I'd spent 2 semesters thinking about that novel, so it was just like in my mind already. And then I was just thinking about that character and wanting to do more with her and explore what had happened before she arrived in the events of the novel. And at the time, I'd spent so much time drafting the novel, I was like, I'd like to have some short stories to send out. But I'm just like, my brain is just like circling this novel idea and I can't really get out of it. And so I think that's how that short story happened. I was like, I just want to send something. I just want to have something to send out into the world. And when you're working on a novel, you just really, I don't know, maybe I'm impatient. I don't know. I was like, I just want to show people like a bit of this. Yeah.
I don't know, based on Twitter stuff, it just seems to take forever. Like I know people make the jokes about I have an announcement coming soon.
Yeah.
I could only imagine the waiting. So you kind of mentioned that you have a story coming out in Unfettered Hexes, which is from Neon Hemlock Press. I pre-ordered it. I highly recommend people pre-order it or get a copy after it comes out, because the lineup is fantastic.
It is amazing.
So great. And do you have any other like short stories coming out, or we know the novel's like coming eventually, coming not soon enough, but yeah, anything we should like keep an eye out for?
I have another story coming out in a different anthology, if I can remember the name, because the title of the anthology is very long. Dark Moon Books has a horror anthology coming out in November. You can pre-order it now, and that is titled Charlatan Bardot's Guide to the Most Fictional Haunted Buildings in the Weird Wild World. I think that's close to the title. I feel like I don't write a lot of horror. I think I write a lot of things that maybe have like horror-ish elements. And so the story that I have in there is like yeah, more on the horror side, maybe than some of my other stuff. And so that is out for pre-order right now. And I have another thing that I'm very, very excited about. That is a big project that I've worked on, and I can't talk about it yet. So I'm gonna do the Twitter thing where all the writers just like scream about like having this thing they're super excited about and can't talk about, but maybe someday. Yeah, look out for that.
Well, thank you for joining me today. I'm at the end of my questions. Is there anything that came up that you wanted to revisit, or any last thing you wanted to touch on before we sign off?
I don't know. I think I'm just now like getting into like booktube stuff. And so like it was really cool when you reached out to me. I was like, oh my God, this is super cool. So like yeah, I feel like this work that you're doing is like so vital and so important. So yeah, just like thank you for your work.
Oh, thank you so much for appearing, because the show doesn't exist without the the interview doesn't happen without the guest. And thank you for all the work you've created. I'm gonna have Tamara's links in the description box below, website, Twitter, all that good stuff. And yeah, thank you everyone for watching. Thanks for joining. Have a good one and take care. Bye.